Hello, I'm Dr. Gerald Mahoney, the Associate Dean for Research and Training here at MSAS. And I want to welcome you all to our first Research and Training lecture for the 2017-2018 academic year. This year's lectures will focus on the Grand Challenges Initiative, which is sponsored by the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare. The Grand Challenges for Social Work is a groundbreaking initiative designed to champion social progress powered by science. It is a call to action for all of us to work together to tackle our nation's toughest social problems. As many of you are aware, the Academy has identified 12 grand challenges. This year, the MSAS Research and Training Lectures will focus on 4 of these initiatives. Today, we'll have a presentation from 2 dynamic leaders and co-founders of the SMART Decarceration Initiative. Not only have Dr. Epperson and Dr. Carrie Pettis-Davis co-founded this initiative, but they have a co-edited volume entitled SMART Decarceration, Achieving Criminal Justice Transformation in the 21st Century, that will be published next month. I thought we were going to have brochures in the back of the room, but we made it even more convenient for you, so you have an order form if you're interested in purchasing this book, and I think you get an author's discount for doing that, correct? Okay. So our second lecture, I want to announce that now, which will take place on December 8th, will focus on the Stopping Family Violence Grand Challenge. Our speakers will be 2 of the leaders of this initiative as well. Dr. Jill Messing from the School of Social Work at Arizona State University, and Dr. Richard Barth, the Dean of the School of Social Work at University of Maryland, will be the speakers for that lecture on December 8th. We're now in the process of planning 2 more Grand Challenge lectures for the spring semester. I ask you to provide suggestions for topics and or speakers that you would like to invite to MSAS. Plans will be finalized within the next month, so please send your suggestions to me as soon as possible. Without further ado, I want to introduce today's speakers. Dr. Carrie Pettis is an assistant professor at the Brown School of Social Work at Washington University in St. Louis, where she is also the founding director of the Institute for Advancing Justice, Research, and Innovation. Dr. Pettis-Davis received her PhD from the University of North Carolina School of Social Work and her master's and bachelor's degrees in social work from the University of Kansas School of Social Welfare. Her research is focused on decarceration of American prisons and jails through policy reform and behavioral intervention development. Dr. Pettis-Davis is interested in the ways in which policies can be transformed to reduce racial and economic disparities within criminal justice system. Her behavioral intervention research is focused on working with community partners to develop and test interventions to enhance positive social support, reduce substance abuse, and respond to trauma experiences among justice-involved adults. Dr. Pettis-Davis has an active portfolio of research and direct practice experience centered on criminal justice. She is currently principal or co-principal investigator on 4 research projects, including 2 federal and 2 foundation-funded sponsored grants. Dr. Matthew Epperson is our second speaker. They'll speak together, actually. He's currently associate professor at the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration. His research focuses on the vulnerabilities of adults who are under criminal justice supervision to a myriad of social issues, including HIV and other sexually transmitted infections, drug and alcohol disorders, and mental illness. His particular interests lie at the interface of social work and criminal justice. He is currently conducting research on co-occurring problems of HIV, substance abuse, mental illness, and criminal justice involvement. He has numerous publications and is often sought out to give presentations on these topics. He is currently co-investigator for an efficacy trial of a multimedia HIV prevention intervention targeting women in the criminal justice system. He was also recently funded by the National Institute of Justice to evaluate the effectiveness of court-based responses to persons with mental illness in Illinois and New Jersey. Dr. Epperson received his PhD from Columbia University School of Social Work and MSW from Grand Valley State University and a bachelor's degree in sociology and criminal justice from Central Michigan University. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Behavioral Health Services and Criminal Justice at Rutgers University. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speakers.
I'm just going to see if I can navigate this first. Oh, I'm on. Just seeing if I can navigate the technology first. So good afternoon. Happy Friday. It's great to see this turnout on a Friday afternoon. I'm sure food had absolutely nothing to do with it. So what I want to do is I'm going to talk for a little bit. Matt's going to talk for a little bit. I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then you're going to talk for a little bit. Does that sound okay? All right. So I'm going to give you a roadmap first to just kind of give you an idea of where we're headed today. So what we want to start off with is to really give you this understanding of what the Smart Decarceration Initiative is and what problem really prompted us to develop the Smart Decarceration Initiative. Then we're going to talk about research practice policy partnerships and how that operates in our work, both with the Smart Decarceration Initiative and the larger grand challenges. Some of you are going to have more or less familiarity with the grand challenges of social work. So since we're the first in the series talking on the grand challenges, we're just going to give you a little bit of history on how that came about, what it looks like and where it's headed. And then we'll get more specific into the Promote Smart Decarceration Grand Challenge Network and some of the work that we're doing. And finally, we want to end with a concrete example of how we've engaged research and practice policy partners to work on a deferred prosecution project. Anybody want to add anything to that? Seems like enough for right now. All right, so first I'm going to ask you a question. How many people have heard the term decarceration? A few of you, not all, all right. How many of you have ever known someone who's been incarcerated? And keep thinking. Almost all of you, right? So we had about a third of you have heard the term decarceration, and probably, I'm guesstimating, about 80% of you have known somebody who's been incarcerated before. And that is because there has been a tremendous shift over the past 40 years or so in our country in how we use incarceration and who becomes incarcerated. Now, this is because of a whole host of societal factors that really started colliding, so to speak, in the 70s and 80s. And this was a bipartisan effort. Mass incarceration, the dramatic rise of incarceration rates in the United States is something that was equally contributed to by people from Democrat and Republican parties, by people with good intentions for reducing disparities, and by people who thought locking people up and throwing away the key was the way to go. And what this has resulted in is we've had this huge spike in incarceration rates in our prisons, in our jails, in the adult criminal justice system, so large, in fact, that now the United States is the leading incarcerator in the world, and we're the leading incarcerator by a lot. Now, because I'm a researcher, I'm going to have to specify for a second. There is actually one other country that out-incarcerates us. It's called Seychelles. Thank you. And how many people do they have in Seychelles, which I can't ever pronounce? Seychelles. 95,000. They have 95,000 people in the entire country, and they have an incarceration rate of 750 per 100,000. We have an incarceration rate of 720 per 100,000. Who is the next largest incarcerator? Russia. Guess what their incarceration rate is? 450 per 100,000. So we not only out-incarcerate people, we out-incarcerate them by a lot. So what this means for us is we're at this moment in history where we have incredibly high incarceration rates, and we don't have anybody to look to try to figure out how do we get out of this situation. And it's also something that we haven't historically experienced in the United States. Now, we have another justice system in the United States, right? It's the juvenile justice system, right? See this little line down at the bottom of the graph? It's that light blue. Can you guys see it? What do you think that is? Youth. It's youth, right? So as youth, although we've had some problems in the youth system, incarcerating youth is a problem, we have not experienced in the juvenile justice system the dramatic rise of the use of incarceration that we've experienced in the adult system. And a lot of things come along with incarceration. So I talked about how there were political factors that both parties were doing things, some with good intentions, some with not so good intentions, that contributed to this problem. Some other societal factors have contributed to this problem. One is related to behavioral health issues or substance use disorders. What was one of the things that was occurring in this country in the 1980s around substance use? Crack cocaine. And how did we respond to it? Well, war on drugs. So we criminalized a public health issue. What else was occurring at the same time, though? There was a rise in violent crime, actually. So instead of thinking through what the various factors might be that contribute to a rise in crime, we started to criminalize lots of behaviors. What happened in the 1950s and the 1960s around mental health? The deinstitutionalization of psychiatric hospitals. So the psychiatric hospitals were cut, their population was cut in half in about a 10-year period. Where did individuals go that used to go to psychiatric hospitals when they were in mental health crises? Jail. They started going to jails and prisons because the community was not prepared to respond to psychiatric crises, and we didn't know where else to put people to keep them safe. And so now we have, as a result, we have a disproportionate amount of people in jails and prisons who have psychiatric disorders and substance use disorders, not necessarily because of criminal behaviors, but because of the way that we have decided as a society that we respond to the symptoms of people who are sick. Another factor happened that it has way deeper historical roots in our country, and has also resulted in certain communities being disproportionately impacted by mass incarceration. What might that be? Persistence of racially biased practices, right? So there is a disproportionate representation of men of color, particularly black men and Hispanic men, in jails and prisons. Whenever I say that, I have to follow it up with something else that is based in fact and not my opinion. And that is that in the United States, criminal behavior does not predict incarceration. Race and economic status do. And why is that? Because white individuals engage in similar amounts of criminal behavior as black and Hispanic individuals. However, black and Hispanic individuals are more likely to come in contact with law enforcement. When they come in contact with law enforcement, they're more likely to be arrested than their white counterparts. When they're arrested, they're more likely to be charged with an offense. When they're charged with an offense, they're more likely to be convicted. And when they're convicted, they're more likely to be more severely punished. And when they get out of whatever correctional supervision they're in, They're more likely to what? Come in contact with law enforcement again, and therefore are more likely to perpetually cycle through the system again, despite no differences on an aggregate in criminal behavior. So, some good news, since you all look very sufficiently depressed, or at least feeling like this is a major downer so far. So we'll start to get to the good news. One of the things that my colleague Matt Epperson and I started to notice was that we seem to, around once we hit 2010, that there seemed to have been a plateauing off. You'll see on the row at the top of 2008, a plateauing off of incarceration rates. And then after that, we started to see decreases in incarceration rates in the United States. And that made us think, something's happening that's different. And then we started to see, you know what? There seems to be some consensus building around the fact that the way that we're doing criminal justice and the way that we're using incarceration in the United States is not working. It's not fiscally viable. Politicians don't have to get elected on tough on crime platforms anymore. There's something morally wrong with the extent to which we're using incarceration in the United States. And that, coupled with actually concrete numbers that we were seeing around reductions in incarceration, led us to embark on this journey that we now call the Smart Decarceration Initiative. And what that is, so we have defined smart decarceration to be an effective, sustainable strategy that is also socially just. So what we have proposed is that there are three outcomes that must be achieved in order for smart decarceration to be effective, sustainable, and socially just. The easy one is to say incarceration rates have to be reduced, right? Like that's the easy one to say. Harder to do, but it's easy to say we've got to see a substantial reduction in incarceration rates. The second one, though, is we could reduce incarceration rates without addressing race, economic, and behavioral health disparities. But that not only would not be socially just, it also wouldn't be very sustainable. So we're saying any approach that seeks to reduce incarceration rates must simultaneously seek to reduce these social disparities, and if it doesn't, it's not effective. Finally, we could reduce disparities, we could reduce incarceration rates, and then not necessarily see an increase in public safety, or even worse yet, see an uptick in crime. That would get us right back to the situation that we're in before. So we need to see increases in public safety, and one of the ways in which we do that is by seeing increases in individual, family, and community well-being, much of which you're all working on, and much of which high incarceration rates can disrupt or destroy. Are you up next, I think?
Not quite.
No, okay, almost. Sorry. I'm just really excited for Matt to get up here and talk. So the Smart Decarceration Initiative has two primary, I'm putting 5, but I mean 2, has 2 primary focus areas. And that is that on the one hand, we want to really put a lot of energy into front-end reforms or front-end changes in policies and practices. And the way that we talk about that is creating exit strategies really early on. So you can create exit strategies in prosecutors' offices by doing pre-charge interventions, by doing pre-plea interventions, an example of which we'll talk to you about later today. We can increase exit points by adequately resourcing and working with public defenders' offices. Some of you work in specialty courts. That's another exit strategy area. Some of you work in law enforcement. But one of the things that we're seeing with smart decarceration is we really need to put some more energy into the front end reforms because we have a very limited evidence base there. There's very little that we know Because while we were spending so much money on incarcerating people for the past 40 years, we weren't spending money on researching what might work to keep people out of the system. The second thing that the Smart Decarceration Initiative is focused on is preparing the profession of social work to take a more active engagement in decarceration. And that is because the profession, when around the 70s and 80s and this really punitive approach, the abandonment of the rehabilitative ideal started, the profession of social work said, I'm out. This doesn't work for me. So there's not a whole lot of expertise or intergenerational training from a professional level within social work. So we're also hoping to spend a lot of energy preparing the profession, and the Grand Challenge Network is one of the mechanisms for that. Finally, the last thing that I have to say before Matt gets up here is one of the vehicles for making sure that the evidence that we find out from research is actually adopted and applied in practice, and that policy shifts happen as well, is by having partnerships. And these partnerships must be mutualistic. What do I mean by that?
Agree to the same thing.
They have an agreement together. What else happens when things are mutual? Each party benefits equally, right? That's not how we've traditionally approached research and practice, or the application of research to practice. It tends to look more like helicopters. They call it like the helicopter researcher will come in, collect your data in the practice organization, give you some feedback, and then leave, right? And less often will researchers learn from practice in order to inform their research agendas or to inform their research questions. So if there's more of a feedback loop between practitioners and researchers, it's more likely to be beneficial. And again, later in the talk, we're going to tell you some really concrete examples of how this works. And all of you who have been practitioners before know that there's only so far you can get with practice approaches if policy works in conflict with those practice approaches. So it can't just be researchers and practitioners who are in partnership, but it has to be people who are making decisions about policies, both little policies, little p policies, policies that happen within organizations, and larger policies that happen in communities and in jurisdictions. Now Matt's going to talk more about the grand challenges.
All right, well, hello, is it afternoon? Good afternoon. Yeah, building on some of what Carrie was just saying, I think part of why we approach this work, thinking about research, practice, policy, partnerships, is because we were both practitioners, practicing social workers, both in criminal justice and outside of criminal justice settings. And so as a practitioner, I don't ever remember, I worked in residential care with youth, I worked in the court system, I worked in behavioral health, community mental health. Not once did I experience a researcher, coming into the work we were doing and saying, how can we work together? Or here's some evidence base and what do you think about that? Or what can I learn from your work? So there's often this disconnection. As social workers, as Carrie was starting to say too, we professionally experienced a sort of movement away from criminal justice. And as Carrie and I were both starting the Smart Decarceration Initiative, we obviously saw the need for, and a real opportunity, sort of a moment in which we could start a different conversation around decarceration, and we intentionally chose that term as a proactive approach, not just about not incarcerating, but replacing incarceration whenever possible with different kinds of policy and practice innovations. But at our core, we also believe that this was really relevant task for social work. And so who prior to today has heard of or is familiar with the grand challenges for social work? Okay, so a good amount of you. We started hearing about this in about 2012. There was a couple concept papers that came out through the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare. And this is not, social work didn't start this sort of grand challenge idea. Other professions, engineering, medicine, statistics, have come together as a profession to say, what are particular challenges of the day that our profession has a unique responsibility or skill set to address? And how do we define those as a profession? And then how does that help us to organize to move forward to address those grand challenges? Obviously in social work, we are rooted in a social justice orientation. And so the grand challenges for social work, when it was conceived, was really thinking about what are major social problems that in many ways have seemed intractable over the years, but there is a potential for real change to happen, and even within a 10-year period. So there was the idea behind grand challenges in general and specific to social work is really a way for the profession to come together. Who is either a social worker or being trained as a social worker? I'm guessing it's the same people that are familiar with the Grand Challenge. So as you know, we're a pretty diverse profession, right? We do all kinds of micro to macro practice, policy work in all different areas. So there's not often a whole lot that sort of pulls us together as a profession. So part of the idea around this Grand Challenge was to bring the profession together, to also be a way for the social work profession to interact outside of our own profession, to say, here's sort of what we are collectively deciding are our key issues that we want to focus on, and that it would also hopefully spur different kinds of innovation, both research and practice innovations. So just to give you a little idea of how these ideas in 2012 moved into what we now know as the 12 Grand Challenges. This American Academy for Social Work and Social Welfare formed an executive committee, and in 2014, they put out an announcement. Basically, you could submit, brief abstracts of ideas of what you think. Anybody, this was web-based. Anybody, that could, view the web page, could write an idea about. Well, I think, and it's fairly short, like a couple hundred words or less, about here's a problem I think that social work should focus on, and here's why. So Carrie and I, well, we knew some of the, we had heard rumblings about the Grand Challenges initiative. We read some of the concept papers, and we were saying, this really seems kind of analogous to what we're talking about. We're talking about sort of this moment and this potential shift in incarceration. At our core, we're social workers, and so we believe this is not just important for us as individuals, but for our profession to really take a leadership role in, which they had not done in any kind of criminal justice or juvenile justice reform for quite a few years. And so we wrote one of those little pieces. There were 79 other folks that did that, so there were 80 of these ideas that were generated online. From that, this executive committee chose 20 of those ideas, and the folks that wrote those ideas, and asked them to submit concept papers. So we were asked to submit a concept paper. And then after some time, in late 2014, this executive committee chose these 12 grand challenges for social work. And just to give you an idea, when the call for the papers came out, these were the criteria: that it has to be a big challenge, but there's evidence indicating that this challenge there could be significant movement in this challenge. And you have to define measurable progress that can be made in a decade, which is some of the outcomes that Carrie spoke of. And that actually helped us, this grand challenge helped us to think through what exactly would we want to see in a decade around decarceration. That the challenge has a particular relevance to social work, but that it calls for interdisciplinary collaboration. So it's not something that social work can just sort of own and solve on its own, but there needs to be mechanisms by which we collaborate with other professions and other disciplines. And that it's a challenge that requires significant innovation. So we saw this, we thought it's absolutely what we're talking about with decarceration on all those fronts. And so we submitted a paper for that. We were really happy that it ultimately was chosen. as one of the grand challenges. These are all 12. And as you see, these are big problems, right? Stopping family violence, reducing economic inequality, ending homelessness, and these are largely US focused, are big challenges. And I would argue that these are challenges that really require, when we talk about significant innovations, it requires this integration of research, policy, and practice. It cannot be, sort of shelf research that studies get done and end up getting published, and 12 other academics read it and think, wow, you did great work, but it doesn't make real world change. These grand challenges are ones that call for the kinds of innovations that produce real world change. So on the Academy's website, this is part of the Promote Smart Decarceration sort of the description. The concept paper that we wrote is also available on that website if you're interested in reading it, to just sort of how we laid out that challenge and how we responded to those 5 criteria. There's also different ways. We have some stuff we could send you if you're interested in ways to get involved or become more informed on the grand challenge. So this was great, right? We got chosen as one of these 12 grand challenges. That felt great. We're like, okay, this, we feel like at the profession level that there's some response to this issue. And then we were sort of like, okay, now what? There are 2 of us leading this thing. Some of these other grand challenges have like 30 people leading them. And we were both relatively junior, but we both had intensive practice experience in criminal justice. And I hope it comes through. And Carrie and I met at a CSWE conference, and it was clear that she had a passion for doing things different in criminal justice as I did, and that's part of what was driving us. And so we thought, how do we sort of organize this own grand challenge in a way that's going to produce some results? And we quickly realized that it wasn't going to be the result of just the 2 of us doing this work. So through a variety of channels, we asked for volunteers of who was motivated and had skill sets around different aspects of the grand challenge. We got over 100 individuals who volunteered. We did this through the Society for Social Work and Research Conference, through the Grand Challenges website, through different networks of folks that if we felt like we needed some more folks in policy, we reached out to the policy folks we knew. And we created these, oh, and I see a typo, Policy working group. That should be policy, sorry. We just started the policy working group, so I just typed that in yesterday. So, and part of why we did that is we were trying to think 3 is sort of a nice solid number. So we have research working group, we have an education working group that focuses on how we train social workers, not just in the classroom, but in terms of field-based education at the bachelor's, master's, and doctoral level. And then we were thinking of practice as sort of like, let's think of it as micro to macro practice. Like, how does social work practice potentially influence decarceration? Well, what we quickly found within this practice working group is there are folks who are more focused on micro practice, who might be doing behavioral health interventions for people at risk of criminal justice involvement. There are other folks who are interested in policy practice, and so how we might think about altering laws that are called collateral consequences or civil disabilities, so laws that provide all these civic and legal exclusions for people with a criminal record, which actually in many ways puts them at higher risk to come back into the system because they don't have the same access to housing, different kinds of services, education, employment. Those are fairly different approaches, right? And so we just sort of started this policy group as an offshoot of the practice group. And you'll see the leaders of the different, we have co-leads of each working group. And right now we have one person who's doing double duty in 2 groups because he literally Mel Wilson from the NASW just moved to the policy working group. And so we're about to select a second person to lead the practice working group. But I hope what you see here is that what we intentionally tried to do by selecting co-leads for these groups, and then how these groups are constructed, that this is not just a research endeavor. So having somebody who works with the National Association of Social Workers at the national level keeps this out of just an academic audience. Having Charles Lewis from the Congressional Research Institute on Social Policy is a way to make sure that we're, again, not just sort of talking to each other as academics. We also have formal connections to the Society for Social Work and Research on the research front, the Council for Social Work Education, because again, if our education group comes up with these great ideas, but we don't communicate with the national accrediting body for social work education, we're probably not going to see real world change happen in classrooms, right? Or in field placements. So these are the working group leaders. They've been engaged in a process over the last year to really identify, because remember this Grand Challenge is focused on a sort of 10-year initial period. So not rushing into short-term, sort of not well-planned solutions. We've asked these groups to engage in a strategic plan, to develop an action plan where they identify focus areas, key activities to address those focus areas. Obviously, who is responsible? You can tell we're both clinicians, right? This sounds like a treatment plan, right? Who will do what, to what extent, for how long? It's a SMART goal, right? A SMART objective, a timeline, and then what will deliverables be? What will you actually be producing as a result of these activities? And as it relates to research practice policy exchanges, Carrie and I interact with all of these working groups with the leaders, and we're starting to see how their focus areas are developing, and we may see a link between the policy focus group and the research focus group. And so our job in this is really to try to help synthesize the work of these somewhat distinct groups in ways that will advance these partnerships. So if there's some research that the research group that could engage in that will build on some promising practice that the practice group has identified, that's one way that we're trying to build connections between groups. We asked these co-leads to make a firm commitment to some pre-established expectations. So we asked for at least a minimum time commitment, a commitment to not just sort of do, I mean, we're academics, and so there's a currency for academics, you know, publishing papers, writing grants, and those are all great things. But we also asked them to make a commitment in terms of sort of service to this grand challenge and being able to work with other groups, because those are sometimes intangibles that don't always show up on a CV, but it's the kind of expectations that we have from the co-leads. Defining levels of engagement for various stakeholders. So some folks are all in, like it's so closely aligned with their work, and so it's sort of seamless how they get engaged. There's other folks that, you know, will come in contact with us and say, this all sounds really interesting, like decarceration, but it's not so much right in my wheelhouse, but this is what I do. Is Faye here? Faye was talking earlier, a doctoral student, about how she looks at family support and stress for caregiving. So if we chatted, I bet we could come up with some idea of how that approach or her substantive area has some connection to decarceration. I teach a criminal justice social work interface class, and for master's students, and I right off the bat say, whatever area of practice you're interested in, micro to macro, whatever substantive area, I defy you to come up with a social work relevant topic that doesn't touch criminal justice and incarceration somehow, because as Carrie said, it's become such a phenomenon that it touches behavioral health, it touches aging, it touches the foster care, it touches families, communities. So again, having them go through the strategic action plan with clear outcomes, and then as leaders of the Grand Challenge, we're consistently communicating with these working groups. So that's sort of a example of, sort of what's happening at a broader professional level. That might feel a little loose, or sort of, okay, that sounds like a whole lot of folks doing a whole lot of meetings and figuring things out, but it hasn't really resulted in tangible products yet. So the second thing that we want to talk about is drilling down into a research project. It's actually the first formal research project that the Smart Decarceration Initiative has engaged in across both University of Chicago and Washington University. And that is a study on deferred prosecution. So we're going to do another poll. Who has, right now, who has heard of the term deferred prosecution or something like deferred prosecution? Okay, so a handful of folks. When we were planning this initiative and reaching out to partner organizations and talking with folks that were sort of leaders on criminal justice reform at the national level, we kept hearing, there's one sort of group that's often left out of these decisions. So you'll get like the head of a Department of Corrections at these meetings, and you'll get probation, and you'll get the courts, but who's often not there at the table is a prosecutor. But prosecutors have a huge amount of power in the criminal justice system. Along with our idea how we focus on front-end innovations, prosecutors are one of the most upstream folks in the criminal justice system. They decide what charges are placed on somebody, how many, how they'll pursue them, what kinds of sentencing that they'll push for if a person is convicted or pleads guilty. And so for our 2015 conference, we invited a prosecutor named John Chisholm, who is the district attorney in Milwaukee County, who has gotten a lot of, or a good amount of national attention because he basically allowed the Vera Institute of Justice to come in and look at their data, look at their processes, and ask them, help us understand why we have racial disparities in our system, which is a pretty bold move for a prosecutor to do. There's a great, if you're interested in that sort of process, there's a great article in the New Yorker. If you Google New Yorker, John Chisholm, you'll find that. So he came and spoke at our 2015 conference alongside a man named Ronald Simpson Bay, who spent 26 years in prison on a conviction that was ultimately overturned because of prosecutorial misconduct. So he was convicted of murder for a murder he did not commit, and it was proven that the prosecution basically ignored evidence to the contrary. While he was in prison, obviously as if 26 years in prison wasn't enough, his son was murdered while he was in prison. And as somebody who then shared both of these roles, right, as sort of somebody who has been convicted of an offense, even one that he didn't commit, and is being punished for it, he's also an indirect victim of a violent offense at the same time. The two of them had this great conversation around the role of prosecutors and how they're often ignored. It's sort of like a black box in the criminal justice system. So that really got us excited and thinking. We started talking with John Chisholm in Cook County, Illinois. Sometimes I'm in Chicago, so I don't always know how much stuff translates outside of Chicago. But in Cook County, Illinois, our state's attorney, who's our primary prosecutor, was a very contentious race. Anita Alvarez, who was the state's attorney, got a huge amount of criticism, especially in the way she handled and her office handled the video release of the police murder of Laquan McDonald. So she was lost in the primary to the person who ended up being elected state's attorney named Kim Foxx. Has anybody heard of Kim Foxx? See, I thought it was maybe just a Chicago thing. So yeah, Kim Foxx is big in Chicago. And in St. Louis, they have just recently elected a new progressive prosecutor named Kim Gardner. So here we have three prosecutors who are wanting to do things differently. And in our so a lot of how this project came about in terms of partnerships is we just started engaging in conversations with them. What's your philosophy around prosecution? What kind of programs do you have? And we found that in all three sites, they have something that's actually pretty innovative around deferred prosecution, which is essentially where a prosecutor will say, or prosecutor's office will say, for this particular charge or whatever the eligibility criteria are, instead of prosecuting it as usual, we will defer it, we'll pause it, and do something else instead. That something else instead for a misdemeanor might just be go get an assessment and stay out of trouble for 6 months. For something more, like a felony or a more serious charge, it might be, some kind of supervision involved. And there are differences in how they're structured, but at the end of that set time period, if the person has successfully met the criteria, their case is dismissed. Some of the more progressive programs are pre-charged. They don't even actually level the charge on the person, and so they don't have to, there's no plea or anything involved. And so this is a very much upstream intervention, right? Because not only does the person potentially avoid incarceration, but if their prosecution is paused and they end up with their charge dismissed, they don't end up with a criminal conviction at all, which saves them from some of these ongoing collateral consequences that happen, right? So we were really, now one disclaimer, well, one thing we're finding by studying these programs is that it's not always as clean as it sounds, because your arrest still shows up, and so you have to go through processes of expungement to get the arrest taken off. So like that was one of the things we found out right off the bat as we talked with clients and observed the programs, is that case dismissed doesn't mean everything about your involvement with the system is invisible to the public. So we see this as a really promising intervention. There's been almost no research done on deferred prosecution programs. There was a really limited study in Cook County that wasn't rigorous, that showed some modest effects in reducing recidivism. But again, there's almost no standardization of what it even means. And as we talked to these 3 jurisdictions, we started to hear them talk about their processes very differently. Some of them were in common, some of them had different terms. And so as researchers, we saw this as a promising practice intervention that was informing our research ideas. And so we applied to the Laura and John Arnold Foundation to say, this is a really promising intervention. There needs to be a stronger evidence base on it. We think that this is something that should be implemented more widely, but we also don't know how effective these programs are. And so we received funding from them for a 2-year sort of foundational study. We're about halfway through that study right now, looking at these 3 jurisdictions. Again, the research questions derived from the practice innovations. What are the levels of folks coming in? What kind of charges do they have? How have these programs evolved over time? Again, as a clinician, I would say not prosecuting somebody is not an intervention. That's just something you don't do. So what do you do instead? And we're finding a pretty nice variety of things, and sometimes they're not doing much instead, and we're learning that there's different kinds of interventions that we could bring in. So this is a mixed methods approach. We've done a whole host of interviews and observations across all 3 sites with participants, prosecutors, staff, other court staff, treatment providers. We've sat in on and observed the sessions where this deferred prosecution is offered, and seen how clients sort of wrestle with, do they want to do this or not. We've talked with defenders about how they discuss the relative merits of this kind of program. So that's the qualitative piece. The quantitative piece is right now, we're starting to look at administrative data from all 3 of these programs to start to get some ideas, obviously about descriptives, about client flow and charges and all of that, but also trying to get a sense of what kind of factors seem to be key ingredients in these interventions, and what kinds of mediators, what might we be able to test in a more rigorous evaluation. And so this is a collaborative process where it's kind of hard to engage. I don't know how many of you work in research with an active sort of site outside of the university. It's one thing if you go to them with a really concrete plan and say, this is what we want to do. Or you plan it together, this is what we want to do, and now let's apply for funding. It's quite another thing to say, are you willing to engage in this journey with us that we're not really sure what's going to be at the end of it? We're not really sure yet what we're going to find out about your program, but we want to learn from you, and we want to bring our expertise in. And then the idea being, if you're still willing to work with us in 2 years, that we're going to have a rigorous evaluation, more than likely a randomized controlled trial, to generate rigorous evidence around these interventions. So far they're doing it, and we're pretty confident that that they're going to continue to work with us in these ways. And so Carrie's going to talk a little bit about some of the things we're finding and how we're starting to disseminate that information.
Yeah, so going back, oh, I don't think I'm on yet. Is my microphone on? No? Okay, so I'm just going to talk really loud, which you may have noticed that I'm already good at. So it's back on, so stop yelling at you. So one of the things that we found in research practice policy partnerships is in line with the agreed upon goals and the mutualistic benefits is that you have to have some kind of product that can be used and disseminated. So as part of the deferred prosecution project, we identified a host of products that could be used and disseminated. One of the things that Matt talked about was the fact that there wasn't really a uniform model of deferred prosecution. Those of you, I know there's some of you in the room that work in reentry, you also know there's not a uniform model of reentry. The lack of uniform models in practice makes it really hard for people to identify and adopt best practices. So one of the first products that we agreed upon was to develop these logic models. What are the inputs, the outputs, the short-term outcomes, the intermediate outcomes, the long-term outcomes for people who are doing deferred prosecution? And that's something that the offices that we're working with can use, but it's also something that future prosecutors' offices can use as well. The next thing that we talked through is like, okay, say that we have these logic models and we figure out that this is going really well, it's feasible, acceptable, it's improving results, there's fewer people going to the criminal justice system. If somebody else wants to adopt this, what are we going to tell them? So we immediately recognized we need to have some type of implementation guide, some kind of how-to manual. What are the key ingredients? Not every jurisdiction is alike. Every office is going to look a little bit different. What are those things that can be adapted by jurisdiction? What are some decisions local jurisdictions will have to make? And what are some really key ingredients that if you take this out, you're not likely to see the same types of effects that we saw in these initial models? And we want to put all of that in to an implementation guide. So we got through our first draft of the implementation guide a couple of months ago, and part of even doing that process, we identified information that we still didn't have, more research questions that we needed to ask, more programmatic questions that the sites needed to ask. So we could think through about how do we really get really clear in telling people or giving people guidance on what to do next. It's also important, an important form of getting information out to wide ranges of people, particularly decision makers, either administrators, decision makers in practices, or policy-making decision makers, is to write stuff up in a really short form. Not like academics, right? We need to put together briefs that synthesize and summarize an enormous amount of complex information in a very simple form, and try to keep it as limited as possible, but informative as possible. So that's another product that we're working on. And then, like Matt mentioned, we also wanted to develop, we want to use, let me say, the gold standard in research practices, which is randomized control trials. Randomized control trials in the context of deferred prosecution gets really slippery, right? Because if you use a traditional assignment method that you would use in treatment approaches where one group gets it, the other person does, the other group doesn't, or they get something else. In this case, you potentially would be randomizing people into punishment, right? And we don't want to do that, but we also know the rigor and the level of reliable information that randomized control trials give us. So as a part of this partnership, as we're trying to figure out how can we do a randomized control trial that is ethical, that is responsible, that doesn't randomize people into worse outcomes potentially, but also helps us understand this process. Randomized control trials are particularly complex in criminal justice settings. And just like we don't have a lot of guideposts to get out of decarceration, we don't have a lot of guideposts with this either. So those were some concrete products that came out of the deferred prosecution project. Zooming back out to the Grand Challenge and to smart decarceration work, we also have disseminable, which apparently is a very difficult word for me to pronounce, but we also have products there that can be shared with others so that other people can reflect on, react to, learn from the same types of things that we're seeing. So we have books and book chapters. We have the book that's in front of you. There's another book a book series that Oxford University Press has all the Grand Challenge networks under contract for, which is to do short books on each Grand Challenge. There's multiple book chapters. Also at the larger Grand Challenge level, we're doing practice briefs, policy action statements, policy recommendations that can easily be disseminated at federal, local, state levels. We also, Matt mentioned a conference, so through the Smart Decarceration Initiative, we hosted the first national conference ever on smart decarceration at Washington University in St. Louis in 2015. And there we brought together researchers, it was about a quarter of the group, practitioners, about another quarter, policy, decision maker, about another quarter, and then people who were and service providers, and then people who had directly been involved in the criminal justice system as well, so that we got these multiple perspectives. And during that conference, we created collectively guideposts and concrete strategies that people could use to engage in criminal justice reform. And we disseminated that not only through a book chapter, but also through a technical report that people all around the country could refer to. Because we're academics, it's also really important for us to contribute directly to peer-reviewed scholarship so that people, again, can build on, critique, do similarly, do differently, the type of work that we're doing. Podcast is a new thing to me, but what was the university that? Buffalo University hosts a social work podcast series, and so they invited us to do podcasts on smart decarceration, and that generated a couple thousand of people listening to it within the first week. We've also been on radio shows and newspaper articles. We have a social media presence. We're really trying to think about, and research, let me say it differently. Research practice policy partnerships force us to think about how we disseminate information in very different ways than just traditional research approaches. And so we're getting up to speed really quickly on that.
Real quick.
Yeah.
We have our second conference that's happening November 2nd through 4th at the University of Chicago. And if you're interested, you can go to our website, or I do have a few flyers in the back. If you want to come visit Chicago and come to the next conference, it's in less than 2 months.
And it's a similar composition of people who will be on the panels, in the discussion groups, and in the audience. And that reminded me of something. Oh, I was going to say, speaking of social media, we also tweeted out the registration link, which I know those of you who are active social media people will laugh, but it's very new to me. So future directions for smart decarceration, for the Grand Challenge, promote smart decarceration. We're really in the process of developing research practice policy partnerships and models for it within the context of decarceration and criminal justice reform. We're working on replication studies and implementation strategies. Many of you may know there's a whole science around implementing scientific discovery into practice and disseminating it. We're looking at incentivizing, ways that we can think through incentivizing research practice policy partnerships, because it isn't something that's really financially or otherwise incentivized in our current context, particularly not in criminal justice anyway. We'll continue to convene multi-sector partnerships, not only through the conferences, but in other formats as well. And then we're also, like Matt talked about earlier, really looking at how do we integrate training of newcomer social workers as well as veteran social workers as well. So now that we've both talked quite a bit for about an hour now, I want to go ahead and open it up to questions, discussion, comments. And we have somebody with a microphone, yes, who's going to be able to run around or walk around.
Thank you for your presentation, and I'm delighted to see practitioners leading the research efforts, and so that's wonderful. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about specific roles that social workers would play in some of these interventions, especially like the deferred incarceration or deferred prosecution. I'm sorry, yeah. Right.
So I'll start, and then you want to. So with deferred prosecution, one of the really important roles for social workers is to be there to help to intervene or provide supports on those factors that may either have contributed to the behavior that helped the individual get involved with the system, or are present and had nothing to do with it, but now we've got this opportunity to identify a person who potentially needs support. But if social workers aren't engaged with the prosecutor's office, or in some cases like Milwaukee, employed by contract with the prosecutor's office, then the prosecutors may not have a mechanism with which to get people support. I do want to say one kind of caveat to that. The thing that, where I think social workers can also help with prosecutors is that not everybody who comes into contact with law enforcement or is charged with an offense needs intervention. In terms of not everybody needs substance abuse treatment or employment help or need to be forced to go through social services. That in and of itself can become something that is more problematic than not. And a lot of legal professionals are not trained on distinguishing the difference between that, and can turn intentional alternatives to incarceration or to the criminal justice system into a blunt object instead of something that's a little more nuanced. And I think social workers can help in that way. There's all other sorts of places along the criminal justice system that social workers can help, as well as in community organizations that don't have anything to do with criminal justice. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I guess I would just to illustrate a couple points with the programs that we're looking at. So in Milwaukee County, they actually contract with an organization called Justice Point that directly provides the bulk of their services. So when somebody is accepted into the deferred prosecution program and they agree to it, one of the first things that happens is a thorough assessment, often by a social worker, by a human services professional from Justice Point, that they then do treatment planning. So they do a lot of direct service provision, but one of the really cool things that they do is they do staffings. Like if anybody studies problem solving courts, there's often staffings, right, where you sort of meet and talk about how a person is progressing in the court. They do these with the felony program in Milwaukee. And so the social worker or the human services professional is sitting right there at the same table with the defender, with the prosecutor, and they're collectively talking about, and those staffings usually come up if there's a problem. If somebody's not complying with some aspect of their expectations. And what we've seen is that social worker voice at that table is incredibly powerful because they understand, they're working the most closely with the client. They understand what's going on. They're looking at family issues. They may actually bring in a family member to say, you know what, I think if we engage, the one I remember specifically was a young adult. He was about 20, still living at home, and the social worker said, with the client's permission, if we bring in mom to this discussion, I think we're going to solve a lot of these issues around maybe him not showing up for this treatment episode or whatever. So in that moment, the social worker really helped to keep things moving in a more rehabilitative direction instead of saying, well, he's failing. So I would say it's really similar roles to the roles that social workers could play in a lot of these alternative kinds of problem-solving courts or specialized, because the focus is much more on providing some kind of treatment.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask a question about your research on deferred prosecution. Deferred prosecution has always been available to people who have privilege, and so I want to know how you're looking at your study to see who's getting the deferred prosecution, what are the practices, especially for people of color, people who are low income and marginalized, maybe have substance abuse problems, and how that relates to social work practice.
It's always been available via prosecutor discretion, right? Right. So often, who a person has representing them, what kind of resources they have, will kind of shape this interaction between defense and prosecution. I would say that these programs are in a way a formalized operation of discretion. So it's having taken previous discretion and making it a more formal program. Now, part of what we're looking at is who gets into these programs in terms of who's screened in, who's screened out. We obviously look at disparities. Part of the discussion we had earlier with some folks from the Begun Center was how do you not just look at, say, recidivism reduction or incarceration reduction, but also look at, are you addressing disparities? So that is a conversation that we'll be in with all three of these prosecutors' offices, that if we see like, oh, it seems to be that folks with a higher income and that are white are more likely to be screened into your program, what do we need to do to alter your screening processes to get in? So we're literally about to get those data from the three programs.
So from a methodological perspective, we're looking at it through both quantitative, administrative, retrospective records, as well as through qualitative interviews, and then through subgroup analysis with the administrative records that we have. There was a question over here. Yep.
Along those same lines, I was just going to ask, in terms of when you're doing deferred prosecution, if they're not formally charging them, the client's rights, for example, counsel, especially for clients who are indigent and can't afford counsel, how are you examining to ensure that their rights are also protected? Because they could be put into the program, but whether or not they're compliant, they don't have the right to an attorney. So they may be in the program, but they might not benefit it as much as somebody who is affluent and does have an attorney who can help guide them through the system.
You mean pre-charge?
Mm-hmm.
You want to go ahead?
Yeah, well, in most programs, they do still consult with often a court-appointed attorney. The pre-charge, I think there is still...
There's the first...
I was going to say, I think they still have access to a consultation, but it's not the same. Like in the programs I know the best right now, having observed them, are in Cook County. And even the misdemeanor program, where it's offered not at arraignment, but at the next court date, it's a requirement that there's defense involved, and that defense has a conversation. Now, we know, anybody that's worked in courts know that conversation may be a minute long, but there is a conversation around, and there are times when the defense attorney might say, you know, you may not want the deferred prosecution because you probably won't be convicted. Like there's not enough evidence here, and so that's actually part of what we have been learning from having interviewed clients, is that it's not a slam dunk like, oh yeah, I'll take that, because especially on these early on interventions, there's still a question of, well, if I go through more formal processing and I'm not convicted, or the case is dropped because there's not enough evidence, and we've taken that information back to prosecutors to say, we want to make sure they're not leveraging that specialized program for cases that they would normally drop. That's what we're trying, that's one of the things we're trying to make sure that they do. And so they do have to have different, evidentiary claims that they're at least for Cook County, there's certain set criteria that they would have to show that it's a provable charge that they can prosecute.
And a lot in St. Louis and other sites, the public defenders oftentimes will refer too if they think that this is going to be a better option for them. There was a question over here I want to make sure we get to. Thanks.
You don't have to walk all the way. Hi, my name is Meredith Francis. I'm a doctoral candidate here. And I'm also involved in the Eradicate Social Isolation Grand Challenge, so props to that. As a researcher and as a practitioner, I've been more involved with the reentry side of things. So I was wondering if you could talk more about how your grand challenge is focusing on that. Thanks.
So, the research center that I direct at WashU is entirely focused on reentry. So there's two primary ways that reentry, of course, drives incarceration rates. And one is that on a national level, 77% of people who get out of prison are rearrested for a new crime within 5 years. And that's because of the substantial lack of formal and informal social supports. So the other way that reentry can drive incarceration rates is that sometimes the way some reentry initiatives are established is there's substantially more oversight by parole and probation officers. So there's heightened opportunity for people to funnel somebody back into the system. So I can't imagine that you could do decarceration without talking about or doing reentry. If you remember earlier that Matt was talking about these working groups are identifying key focus areas. So they're still working through a collective process of what those key focus areas are going to be. We're trying to let that surface somewhat organically, but then also make sure there's coordination across. If for some reason reentry didn't come up as a focus area, I imagine we would have a discussion about that because of the substantial role of it. But then there's another thing too, is that there'll be different focus areas probably every couple of years. But most social workers are introduced to criminal justice through reentry or rehabilitative programs. So I can't imagine it won't come up.
Yeah, you said something interesting about people being incarcerated because of the lack of social support. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that, like what are the lacks and what are the outcomes and everything?
What are the lacks of social support?
Yeah.
And so are you thinking of formal service systems or informal, relationships with other people?
So I was in the juvenile detention center, and sometimes people would have family issues, and we would get a lot of domestic violence. And of course, that is a social work issue with just some counseling or something like that. And so it's not necessarily criminal behavior that they're being incarcerated for. It could be some other social issue.
Right, yeah, absolutely. So this is an area that I focus very specifically on. So of course, I love that you asked the question. So social support, in this case, thinking about social support from other people that you're involved in relationships, not through a service, right? These are people you sit next to on the couch at night or you hang out with in your neighborhood. Social support relationships or social relationships are really complicated. And we know that social relationships influence behaviors. And we know that social relationships can have positive influences or negative influences. We also know, because of all the disparities we discussed about people going in and out of the incarceration settings, is that if there weren't other already really complicated and limited positive social support networks, the ones that were there could have been substantially disrupted, right? So what we've done thus far in practice from a criminal justice perspective, social work perspective, is we tend to just say, is there anybody this person can live with, right? Or is there anybody who can give this person a ride to services? When that is not the right question, because usually there is, but that same person is not necessarily a positive influence. That same person could be contributing to an enormous amount of psychological stress. They could be engaged in their own criminal behaviors. There could be emotional abuse between it. So the question that we have to start asking is not, is there anybody, but how do we increase the likelihood and the amount of positive influences to help support people as they get out, while also recognizing that many of us, I'm sure, have relationships with people that might be somewhat of a negative influence. Maybe it's mom, maybe it's sibling that won't leave you alone. You know, that still can be a negative influence. So while also realizing that you're not ever going to get all the negative influences out of a person's life, you just want to try to increase the amount of positive influence that are surrounding people. So that's how I think about it. Oh.
Does the initiative address issues like criminalization of substance use as something that feeds the prisons?
Yes, we have not, in our shared, and like around deferred prosecution is our first sort of project, but there are lots of folks that are connected with the Grand Challenge that do their, like for instance, I research drug courts that are targeting really high-risk folks. I would be really surprised, similar to your comment about the not having reentry as a focus, if our policy group doesn't end up having a focus on, especially right now, so much is in flux with different kinds of charges around criminalizing or decriminalizing, especially marijuana. And now there's some rhetoric at the federal level about pulling back on some of the reforms around drug sentencing. So it's not a direct focus of our individual research, but that would be, I'm hoping that's something that the Grand Challenge Working Group really cultivates.
Just to add on that, I'll say how one of our projects is focusing on it to some extent, or in maybe a less direct way around criminalization, though, is we just started a study in Chicago and St. Louis where we're asking all sorts of stakeholder groups, from criminal justice actors to everyday community members to people who've been involved with the system, what needs to happen in those respective communities to reduce behavioral health disparities in the criminal justice system. And so we're asking, and that includes mental health, prevalence of people with mental illnesses, as well as substance use disorders. And so we're asking them, what needs to change? Who needs to lead the change? Who's responsible? What kind of resources need to be reallocated or redistributed? Is that an issue? So we're asking at the local level, how do you build social capacity in your community to reduce the likelihood that people are going into incarceration settings because of the symptoms of their disorder? Which I think starts to get at that a little bit.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question. Especially in a lot of communities of color, you have faith-based prison ministries, and I wondered if any of your research or effort involves those type of ministries.
Well, the study that Carrie just mentioned, we literally and we're about to launch it. I don't think I have IRB approval yet. It's submitted, but I think we're really close. I may have gotten an email since we've been here that I got approval. But that would be one of the groups, faith-based groups would be one of the folks that we would bring into that conversation around focusing on in local communities especially. I think what we're trying to do through this study is to say, like, there's not these sort of monolithic, like, oh, this is a policy that if you just do it in all these different places, like, it will reduce behavioral health problems. It's more understanding, like, what at the local level. Some of it is even just defining with the group that's most affected, how do you define your community? Is it a certain zip code? Is it, up to a certain, is it transportation based, and whatever that is, and then identifying the key stakeholders in that area. And our hunch is that one of those key stakeholders is faith-based, is the faith community. And because often, not just in incarceration settings, but often when folks come out, it is different faith-based communities that are engaged in that kind of, in different kinds of work. I know there's a lot in Chicago. There is a ton of activity within different faith communities, both inside of prisons, but also activism around how we need to respond to different kinds of injustices, especially in the last few years around police violence. There's been a lot of engagement with the faith community. I'm on a steering committee that with the city of Chicago that looks at how we respond to people with mental illnesses, and the faith community in the greater Chicago area has been a really instrumental voice in that.
Hi, I'm David Hussey. Thank you for your presentation as well as your session this morning. So as you look at this grand challenge and you look at the trends that you're anticipating in criminal justice, what are some of the implications and opportunities for social work training, particularly on the master's level?
Yeah, well, so I think some of the implications and opportunities actually is that there needs to be a more concentrated effort among faculty members who have knowledge and familiarity in this area to try to develop and infuse courses that are specific to criminal justice into the curriculum. Matt's writing up a website where we've started to collect syllabi from different faculty that are teaching this across the universities. We also have to generate more practicum opportunities that intersect with issues related to criminal justice. So when I moved to St. Louis, I noticed that there were hardly any practicum opportunities. So right off the bat, I created 9 new practicum opportunities within the first couple of years of being there so that social workers can have on-the-ground training. We're also exploring doing skills labs when you can't do a whole course, but skills labs around social work in criminal justice context, what types of practices are similar or different than other contexts, what types of ethical dilemmas may you run into. We've talked about potential post-master's fellowships that are specific to criminal justice settings. One idea that a faculty member in Connecticut came up with is he was like, I think we should do BSW programs in prison. And I was like, that's a terrific idea. But I would also say, before I let Matt talk, I would also say that I think that we have to think simultaneously as the students that are in our schools and coming to our schools, as well as the professionals that are already in the field. And what I experience is there's an enormous hunger for continuing education opportunities for professionals that are in the field. So I think that schools of social work should think about their responsibility and their role in offering those types of continuing education opportunities as well.
Yeah, I would just add to that to say, I think there's really innovative stuff happening all over the country that we start to hear in bits and pieces. There's folks that started this at Michigan State University that do Inside Out courses.
I went to Michigan State.
Did you really?
Yes.
Did you do an Inside Out class?
I can tell them about it.
Tell them about it.
Okay, so that's literally what I was just going to ask them. I can talk on the mic. Can y'all hear me?
Well, it's for the people watching online.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I'm Aaliyah Johnson, and I'm in the social work program here. So I just graduated from Michigan State in May, and I took the Inside Out course in 2011. So the way the program works is Michigan State University pays for the people who are incarcerated. They pay their tuition. And there's like research evidence that people incarcerated, if they have some type of schooling, they either go back into the communities and they're less likely to reincarcerate, or they go on to continue with their education. So we did not use labeling terms, and to this day, I won't call them prisoners or any of those type of things. So it's really like challenging. And you can go to the prison and do any subject. Ours focused on criminal justice, and our social work program at MSU has their own class too that does Inside Out. And we just discussed like criminal justice related issues. They read, and they like smarter than me for real.
In some of those programs, the students at MSU go into the prison for the course.
We go into the prison with them, and it was once a week. We go into the prison, and we have to go through security and all of that stuff. And it was a lot of work. You read and you write, and they do the same work that we do, except for they write their papers, obviously, and we type ours. But yes, that's pretty much the Inside Out program, and I'm hoping that I can talk to someone at CASE so we can implement our own Inside Out program if we already don't have one.
Another thing you can stop
I didn't plan
doing.
you either. That was perfect.
Yeah. Another thing that if you can stop doing if it's happening, I'm not talking about here specifically, but if you know it's if it's happening at other schools, if there's automatic rejection based on felony conviction, stop. Now, that doesn't mean you can't use discretion about the type of offense or anything like that, but automatic rejection happens a lot in schools of social work.
I don't know what your policy here is at CASE.
Okay, it
You
does
don't
not
have,
happen
do you have
here.
the question? Do you have the question on your application? Do you have the felony question on your application?
There's a special
Okay, I want to push back on that just a little bit. So the research on the box in education admissions would say that most universities do not use folks' answer on that box to discriminate against people, but what it does, what it can do, what some studies have shown, a really extensive study in the SUNY system in New York, is that it stops people from completing their application. So if somebody does have a felony conviction, when they see that question, whether the university, whether all the data would support that that university does not use the answer to that question, they presume, for good reason, because in most other areas of their life, that is the judgment that's placed on them. And so that, we just went through this process at the University of Chicago, and this, for the first year, we will not have that question on our application. And it was that research that convinced we had to convince our provost to adhere to that. Now, there is a back-end process where when somebody's admitted, because of course legal gets involved and they say, well, if you don't ask the question and then somebody who's like a super violent serial rapist or something, you know, comes in your program, I said, well, you wouldn't have gotten that from the question anyway, because that person probably wouldn't have marked, yes, they have a felony.
But you get around field placement agencies and then ask it subsequent, and then there'd be a bar there.
So what we do, well, we're still ironing out the process, but in the big picture, what we're going to do is when somebody is offered admission, we're going to say, as part of the field application process, there are field placements that some field placements do criminal background checks. There are some field placements, not only do they do criminal background checks, but you just can't work there if you have a felony conviction, like a school. And so we'll lay that information out, and what we want to avoid is a student inadvertently applying for some field placement and then finding out that there's a background check. So we encourage them to initiate with our field office, and then they advocate with the student. Like they'll just say, don't apply to these because there's just no way you can come in.
It's just subsequent to admission.
Subsequent to admission, just like other kind of ban the box kinds of initiatives have. It doesn't mean that you don't always ask the question, but when you take it from the front end to the back end, then now if you admit somebody and then they say they have a felony conviction and you decide as a school not to admit them, there's serious accountability there because you have to show why you changed your admission decision. So it puts the accountability back on the institution, which I think is a great thing.
It's a tricky issue, but I understand your point. It's well taken, something for us to consider.
It's tricky. So these couple issues, now that there's sort of a vehicle with the Grand Challenge, so Cheryl Kubiak, who is one of the folks who initiated the Inside Out program at MSU, is on our education working group. That's hopefully one of the mechanisms that we will now have a sort of vehicle to distribute like this, besides just this website, which if I didn't write it up, you probably wouldn't know about it, but we can do things through the Council on Social Work Education, developing core content, core syllabi. So if anybody here teaches in a social work class that is largely focused on criminal justice, or you do research in that area, we would love to have you join this website because it's also a network. Actually, John, right? I just was referring John to that website earlier to see like what social work researchers are doing different kinds of criminal justice related research across the country. If you see anything on the teaching resources that you want, my syllabus is there. You can steal anything you want from it. We just ask that you credit the source, but that's the whole idea, is to to further the ideas around, it might be a set of readings, it might be different assignments that you do related to criminal justice.
Could you put the University of Chicago admission process on that website that you just described? Could you put something about that on it?
We could.
Yeah, it sounds like you don't have it totally finalized.
It's not, we took it off our application, and literally we just hired a new dean of students last week. And so her first task is going to be meeting with the small group where we have students and former students who have been incarcerated that are part of that process, that we're going to work out the kinks, the procedure on the back end. I would love to do that. And there's a few other schools that have been, NYU is another school that recently did it. Columbia, I believe, recently did it. So we're going to try to synthesize. I'm actually looking at more of like a kind of policy brief around how we can do that to try to get it in the hands of folks. I think we're out of time. So thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for your attention.